Well, there's a lot of conversations happening about the future of Alberta's energy industry with announcements of the West Coast Pipeline project and now the Northern Shield Energy Corridor in Ontario. So joining us to chat about this is Heather Exner-Pirot. She is the Director of Natural Resources, Energy and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Heather, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so with the West Coast Pipeline, the Prime Minister has been saying that it needs to be privately funded, and there is some private investment coming from Pembina, but it sounds like this project will likely include a lot of government funding. So has the Prime Minister changed his mind on this?
I would think so. I think that's the reality. The truth is, private proponents are building pipelines. We know that South Bow Bridge pipeline is very likely to go ahead. That follows the old Keystone route. There's some other expansions, optimizations. So it's not as though the sector doesn't think that there's a business case for pipelines and for Canadian oil. It's just that for reasons that we are all very familiar with, the West Coast pipeline in Canada is extremely politically risky. And frankly, we're still not at the point where it's been de-risked at all. It has not been approved. It has not fulfilled the duty to consult and accommodate. It's extremely early in the process. So perhaps later on in the process, there may be more private equity interest, more proponent interest. But at this point, I didn't expect that interest at any rate. I was actually surprised that Pembina came on at this early stage.
Yeah, and historically, anytime a project is funded by the government, it seems that there will be a huge cost overruns. Any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, we all have the PTSD from TMX, which ballooned into a $34 billion price tag. And that's what we're all worried about. The things that, relieve my concern a little bit this time is that we're doing that exact same pipeline again. We only finished that one 2 years ago. And so we have a very good idea of what we did well, what we did, wrong, what we need to improve. And actually, the head of the major projects office that the federal government has set up was the CEO of Trans Mountain. And she's obviously brought together a team that thinks that they can do this pipeline again without all the cost overruns, not least because you will have had the political, willingness behind it from the federal government and BC at the front set, which we did not have before.
Mm-hmm. Heather, what kind of incentives could the government offer to private investors to get them to take the risk of a huge investment like this?
Yeah, so there are things you can do to de-risk it. And I'll say, Trans Mountain, although the government fronted the money, financed that pipeline, it's owned by the federal government. It is now profitable. That means that it received enough revenues from the tolls that it pays its principal and its interest, and now even a small dividend. Now that they just settled the tolls, there's other pipeline news this week, finally settled the tolls with the shippers or the upstream producers. That is an asset that now you could monetize, that they probably could sell a share of that pipeline if they wanted to, either to Indigenous groups or to equity firms. And that will be a possibility with this next pipeline as well. So it's not, people say, taxpayers paid for it. In reality, we finance it. We get an asset. When it starts making revenues, then you're in a position to be able to sell it.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible that the increased costs to produce oil that come with the carbon tax and the requirements on the Pathways carbon capture project could actually stop this pipeline from ever being built?
Yeah, so we're not at a stage where we know what that upstream production is going to be able to fill. As I mentioned already, there's already several pipelines in the works, expansions. I counted at about 1.3 million barrels a day, which is a significant increase in our production. This West Coast pipeline would be another million on top of that. And so, right now you could fill those initial pipelines with what we call cheaper brownfield expansions of the existing oil sands. To fill the West Coast pipeline, we're going to need new greenfield oil sands projects. Those are more expensive. You need a lot more capital up front. And so the industrial carbon price pathways certainly add to cost to that. And so I expect Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has indicated there will be some financial incentives like we saw in the original oil sands build-out, royalty relief, accelerated capital cost allowance, those kinds of things that we know work.
The premiers of Alberta and Ontario, Danielle Smith and Doug Ford, announced another pipeline project, the Northern Shield Energy Corridor. And that's going from Hardisty, Alberta to Sarnia, Ontario. So does this project have a realistic chance of getting done?
Yeah, what a week for pipelines. We had a dry spell for years, and now we're having all these pipelines come out of the woodwork.
Right.
I will give credit to Premier Doug Ford. He came to Alberta, was very supportive of pipelines, very supportive of Alberta during Stampede, obviously a Team Canada approach. and I thank him for that. His interest is that they get their oil from Alberta right now, but it goes south underneath the Great Lakes through Wisconsin and Michigan. And the governor of Michigan has threatened for several years to shut down that pipeline. It's Enbridge's Line 5. And so there is a bit of a security risk. I think there's probably a need for a contingency plan, but that it is a bit of a remote threat to me. I'm not sure the economics work to build a whole other pipeline above the Great Lakes. It depends on how you assess that risk. At this point, I don't think the risk of that pipeline shutting down is equivalent to the cost of building that other one. But no problem having a contingency plan. They're only at the feasibility study. There isn't a big, billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars committed here.
Mm-hmm. Why has Wisconsin's governor threatened that?
Yeah, it's primarily Michigan's, although Wisconsin has also had opposition. And that came, I would say, especially in 2020, when it was very popular to be opposed to pipelines. That was often a wedge issue that some politicians used, to distinguish themselves from their opponents. But obviously in 2026, we don't see the same, public opposition to pipelines as we were seeing. I expect it's much less popular. Michigan and Wisconsin themselves need that Alberta oil for their own energy needs. And so that's why, I don't think that pipeline will be shut down. I think that threat has diminished. And that's why I'm not convinced that we need that Northern Shield pipeline. But again, no problem figure out what we would do in the case that we did need it.
Mm-hmm. There are also some concerns that Manitoba could throw a wrench into the wheels on this project.
Yeah, I mean, based on TMX, we know very well in the Constitution, we have much legal precedence that provinces don't have the right to stop interprovincial pipelines. It is 100% in federal jurisdiction and the Canadian Energy Regulator, and they make the distinction of whether it's in the national interest and can go ahead. But of course, you don't want to do it stepping over the toes. You'd rather have it. It's cheaper and easier if you have everyone on side. And so I think it's just at such an early point. People say, well, you haven't done any consultation with Indigenous nations. Well, it's really not at the point where you would have anything meaningful to consult on. It's really just a route at this point. I think more legwork needs to be done before you would need to entertain really in detail those discussions with Manitoba or the communities along the line.
Okay. And I believe that this would be completely Canadian in scope, right? So the oil would not be going to any other nations. Is there enough of a domestic market for this oil going to Ontario?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that oil is Canadian oil going to Ontario. But again, that's the question. You can't have both. You're not going to add 500,000 barrels in demand on top of what we're already sending through the south, through the Great Lakes. So it seems to me it's one or the other. And that's where it gets, very tricky economically, that you're already getting that oil for that price. And so there's certainly, it's called Northern Shield. I think it's a fantastic pipeline. It tugs at the heartstrings of patriots. And of course, but again, it is Alberta oil primarily that is reaching Sarnia. And so again, you'd have to really assess a very high risk of that pipeline in the United States getting shut down to justify it.
Okay. And Doug Ford is saying that it's possible that the Ontario government could own that pipeline. So is there public support for another Crown corporation here?
You have to see how much there is in Ontario. And again, while I always say, the tolls generally cover the costs, it is a liability on the balance sheet. And we're certainly in an era, especially in Ontario, where they're investing in nuclear quite heavily. They're investing in manufacturing capacity. And so there's only so many things, highways, railroads, ring of fire. There's a lot of demands on that public financing. And so again, you would have to prioritize and say, is this really where you want to allocate those billions of dollars? Or is there other public infrastructure that might be a higher priority?
Mm-hmm. And if the West Coast pipeline and the Northern Shield pipeline actually do get built, what are we looking at time-wise? How many years before construction is complete?
I mean, these are well into the 2030s. So we all anticipate that South Bow Bridge or pipeline would go first, the Enbridge mainline expansion, the Trans Mountain expansion, the first one, only 300,000 barrels. That will probably take a few years, and that's almost at the exact right amount of time that we're building pipelines at the same time as we're growing. The West Coast oil pipeline, if everything goes well, would be about 2034, I understand, which again is, we're not in a rush because we have so much other pipe to fill ahead of that time. And then obviously Northern Shield would come, in the late 2030s if it went ahead.
Wow. All right. Heather, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Really appreciate having you on.
Thanks for having me.
Heather Exner-Pirot is the Director of Natural Resources, Energy and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.